Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of Right in Front of My Face, the podcast that talks about big things happening right in front of us. I am your host, Shannon Hull. If you lived or went to school in Seattle in the late 90s, you may very well know my guest this week. Ronan O'Mahoney is one of the founders of the band Left Hand Smoke.
Note by note, line by line, put it up for sale.
He sat down with me to discuss the very uncomfortable topic of anxiety, which is something that Ronan and I both deal with on a daily basis. I wanted to get his take on this particular issue through his lens as a performer, but what came out of our time together was how anxiety has shaped his experience as a father and husband. If anxiety is something you or a loved one experience, this episode is dedicated to you.
Shine on everything. You gotta let it.
Okay, Ronan, so I feel like I should introduce you, and I've been thinking about how I want this intro to go, because I feel like a lot of listeners to this podcast are around our age, which is I am 41.
29.
Ronan's 29 years old. But if you lived in Seattle in the late 90s.
Late 90s, early 2000s, yeah.
I feel like we all know who you were. This is Ronan O'Mahoney of Left Hand Smoke.
Yeah.
And Ronan didn't know this when we met, but I was a huge fan of Left Hand Smoke. and when I met Ronan, I have to say I was pretty proud that I kept it down low.
That's good. My thing is, I always feel like when I meet people now, they're like disappointed. Like, I thought you were so much cooler. You're just this normal, like, boring dad guy.
Oh my God, you're a dad that does preschool drop off.
Exactly.
Damn it.
Yeah.
Such a rock star life. So that is how I knew you. Now I know you through school, which is cool.
Yeah.
And through conversations, because we met, I showed you my podcasting studio that I had no idea how to use at the time. And I was like, hey, you're a musician. You might like these microphones I just bought. Aren't these fun? And we started talking about how to get you on the podcast and what we would talk about. And my immediate pull was to talk about music, because that's what I love and that's what I think is cool. But I think it's really cool that we want to go a little bit deeper than the obvious here, because Ronan is coming on what we're going to title the anxiety episode. and I'm sweating even saying the word.
Nice. Me too.
Ronan and I have bonded over our common affliction, which is anxiety. But what intrigued me is not only how you figured out how to be a performer and get through the anxiety of that, but the backstory of kind of how you realized you had it a little later on in life. So as we talk about the anxiety episode, to inform it, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because you're not originally from Seattle.
No. I was born in Ireland, moved here to Queen Anne Hill, Seattle proper, as I like to call it.
It's proper.
It is 1984. So unlike much of Seattle, I'm probably one of a more original Seattleite than a lot of the folks around here now. But I've been in Seattle, Queen Anne, then Greenwood, now Northeast Seattle.
Yeah, you're a
since
true
84.
local.
Yeah, went to St. Anne's School, Seattle Prep, UW.
All of it. The list goes on.
It's the track. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like a pseudo Seattleite. I'm from Portland. But I am Catholic school track also.
Seattle South?
It's South Seattle. South Seattle, Portland, Oregon. And then went to school at Santa Clara.
Oh, okay.
So met a whole bunch of Seattleites from Seattle Prep there, and then moved up. But my family had moved to Seattle between my freshman and sophomore years at Santa Clara. So I had some really good friends that went to UW.
Yep.
And that is how I discovered, well, I didn't discover Left Hand Smoke. I got to go to shows at the Fidelts and at the Allen Thistle.
The good old days, the glory days.
Exactly. Yeah. So I've been here 20 years, but you're...
Yeah. Well, I actually was going to go to Santa Clara. Like, my whole plan was
really?
Santa Clara. Yeah. I'd gone down. My dad was living in Santa Cruz at the time.
Okay.
So I went down my senior year to go visit the school and thought, yeah, this seems cool. it was a pretty common path.
Like, but Colombo's already here.
Right? Colombo had already played it. Yeah, pretty much. No, the day I got accepted into UW was the day I was going to write my essay for Santa Clara. And then I was just like,
why write the essay?
It kind of was that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little more to it. Like I had a sister who was born my senior year.
Okay.
Which was a nice family surprise. And so I was like, I should probably stick around too. You know?
Yeah.
But I think the sort of laziness of not doing the essay was also a big contributing factor.
Okay. So you didn't have anxiety at that point?
Looking back, I think there was many things that probably attributed to those, sort of lazy habits as a high schooler. That's kind of how I ended up staying at UW, and a bunch of my friends, and one friend in particular was like, "I'm going to UW, dude, and I'm going to be in a frat." And I was like, "What's a frat?" And he's like, because I was like, "Let's have a dorm room together, and you can like bring my weight set from my basement, it'll be cool." And he's like, "What are you talking about? We're going to join the Greek system." And I was like, "What is that?" I think I'd seen like Revenge of the Nerds, and that was all I knew, or like Animal House.
Yeah.
And that's probably how he described it to me too. I was like, "Cool, okay."
So
yeah.
you were in
I was straight into the Greek system at UW.
Okay. What were you?
I was at Sig Ep.
Can you say that?
Sigma Phi Epsilon.
Oh, my brother was a Sig Ep.
At UW?
At U of O.
Oh, okay.
He's a little bit older than you, but...
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, in hindsight, it was great. I still have some of my best friends that I'm friends with now from the house then. But for the band, it was amazing because you're sort of in this little microcosm.
Yeah.
And if one thing catches on, like in any of them, it spreads to all the others, and suddenly you have an audience. So... yeah, it played a huge contributing factor for us.
Well, especially, this was before the internet.
It was before the internet. Yeah.
So
our social media was
say.
Literally like me going from house to house putting up posters.
Totally. I worked for a record label in college, and it was literally stapling signs to polls in Berkeley.
Yeah.
Like with my little staple gun. I had it in my car with stacks of posters.
That was me.
For Dido.
Dido, nice.
Yeah.
Yes. She was cool.
She was. Yeah. Okay, so you form your band.
97 is when we first started. 98 released our first album. It took off pretty quick from there.
Yeah.
But so there was a station called The Mountain. Remember the?
I do.
1037.
1037.
This, again, pre-social media, like early internet and early sort of early radio presence on the internet. So they had a chat room. And I would just like make up different personas and just hammer their chat room.
I just remember chat rooms.
Right? So they had a chat room, but it was like heavily monitored, and the DJs would engage on the chat room as well. And so I would like make up different personas and play the long game on it.
You were the original catfish.
I totally was.
Son of a bitch.
I played the long game though. Like I got in and I would start like kind of getting to know people on there, and I'd just talk about random stuff, and then I'd start to like slip in little comments about the band after a while.
No way.
And then at the same time, our manager was like hammering, from the front door. But we started to like fill some rooms, and then people from the station started to come down, or other listeners would come down and then they'd get in the chat and be like, "Oh yeah, I went to go check that band out. That guy's right." And then the DJ started to like pay attention, and they started playing us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys were big. Now, weren't you one of the only local bands to sell out the Showbox?
There was another band at the time, Mocktube. Remember those guys? Mm-hmm. So Reggie Watts, who's now
yes.
Yeah, Reggie Watts is the music director, musical conductor guy for James Corden.
Yes.
So he was the lead singer of that band at the time. The band Willis,
who
later became the Actual Tigers.
Wow.
But they were
this
also...
is taking it back. Right? Yes, they were.
Way back. So they were before us. They were selling it out around that same time as well. But yeah.
So you're cool with performing this whole time. You're doing fine.
Yeah.
Life is good.
Yeah. But I was always like the rhythm guy.
Okay.
So, and actually, no, as I go back and look, I remember like our first few shows, I just like stand there like frozen. And there's video, and I'm just like, don't move at all. And I remember the managers of these clubs that we'd play would be like, "Hey, dude, you gotta like, at least pretend you're not like scared shitless up there, And part of it was I didn't really know. Like, you don't really realize, at least I didn't, that like people are actually watching you,
right?
And they're like intently watching,
right?
Well, you hope they are anyway, if you're any good. But I go back and watch like videos of our first few shows, and I'm just like frozen to the like nails in my feet. And so, some of the guys' moms or something would be like, "Hey, you gotta like move around, have some fun, smile a little bit, and move your arms and go watch some video of like Keith Richards.
It's supposed to be fun, right?
Yeah. But part of that too is just getting comfortable with like your surroundings up there and understanding like if I turn this up and what happens there and there's a lot to know. Like
there is a lot to know.
Yeah.
And you guys were, relatively new still.
Yeah.
As this whole thing is happening. So I would think.
Well, what's amazing, so I grew up with the singer and the lead guitar player.
Right.
But as I think about it now, we didn't have the lead guitar player in the band until a few months, like a good few months in, maybe 6 months in or so. So it was just me, lead guitar, singer, drummer, bass player.
Okay.
So 4 of us. And I wasn't the most accomplished guitar player at the time. And so, I'd get nervous about stuff. And like, if I'm just kind of hanging back playing rhythm, it was fine. Once it's like, all right, now go play a solo, I'd be like, oh God.
Oh God, right? Everyone's looking.
Right? So, I was aware of that. And then when the other guy came on board, who's the singer's older brother, he's like the best guitar player I've ever seen. And so I was like, oh, okay, my job's way easier now. I can kind of hang back and like focus on a little bit more of the performance rather than like what if I fuck this note up? Right? And so that made it easy. Like a lot of pressure came off.
Yeah.
And being like the rhythm guy, not everybody knows what you do.
Right.
And a lot of people are like, yeah, I don't know, I couldn't even hear you, but it looks like you guys are having fun up there.
Looks like you had a blast.
Yeah. And so
through my 17 Bud Lights.
Right. But like over time, I started to realize like there's a role that you can play as sort of an entertainer, and I wrote a lot of the stuff too, so the contribution came through that.
Right.
And yeah, I'd like to think that people could hear what I was doing, but I don't know if they could, because even if you watch like some big band now, you're like, I don't really know what,
you can't separate
what that one dude's doing versus
sound,
that guy. As an aside, my favorite like backhanded compliment about that was years later we played a show with Maroon 5. It was like one of our big first like opening slots, and backstage after the show we're like hanging out, and the guitar player and the keyboard player from Maroon 5 are like standing there, and they come over like, hey man, you guys were great, that was cool, I liked your set. And the guitar player looks at me and he goes, yeah, I couldn't really tell what you were doing, but man, that other guy was awesome. And I'm like,
oh my God,
that like sums it up right there, but cool. I'm glad you liked the band.
The collective.
The collective sound seemed to make an impact on you.
You're like, that was so good. Yeah. And then it sucked right when you said that.
Yeah.
Well, I can't relate on the level that you're at, but I've told you this before, but I was a pianist.
Yeah.
And I was so crippled with fear of performing anything. I refused to ever play a recital in front of people ever.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't. The fact that you could ever even get up on a stage in front of people and like do this thing that comes from your soul is impressive to me, because I look back and I wonder sometimes, like, would I have played in that big recital if I could have? And even to this day, I'm like, nope, no, I would not. Nope, I was fine. That was fine.
I think what that speaks to sort of the different levels and types of anxiety, right? Because I've often sort of pondered, like, okay, am I just one of those guys who's like trendy anxiety? Like everybody now says they have some level of anxiety, right?
It's true.
And some level of ADD and what have you. It's sort of like mindfulness. It's like a hot trending topic.
It is.
But people experience it in their own ways, and if you feel it, you feel it. You can't take that away from anybody. But I don't think I was ever necessarily, at least early on, the kind of person who would like pull myself out of a situation because I was going to be freaked out about it. I'd sort of like stubbornly shove myself into it, and then suddenly realize in that moment, like, oh God, what have I done? But like fight through it,
Yeah, but that's amazing.
Yeah, but it was sort of offset with this desire to like always want to be out front and like be the person, but then like challenging myself, can I really do this? And in the back of my mind, it was always like, I don't really believe I can, but I think I can. I'm gonna try and get there. So there's sort of this like duality going on where it's like there's a subconscious thing telling me like, you can't do this, and then this other thing where like, I think I can do this, like the the Tony Robbins part of me where I'm like, I got to get out here and like just go for it,
But I think that's one of what impresses me about that, is that that's a very mature take. You were young at that time. We were still just trying to fight through it. But that, I think a little bit, that speaks to your calling to music.
Yeah, maybe.
Right? Because I don't, being able to recognize that that's something that you want to do and fight through the anxiety. Like for me, the scenario that we're in right now, having this podcast, that's me.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I have no right to be here. You know what I mean? Like it's that thing, but I feel good about it and I want to do it so I can fight through that like utter insecurity.
Yeah, that's a good point. So to sort of go back to what we're saying, in a similar example, then, if you had like 6 other people around you and you were just part of a thing, it would probably be a lot easier, right? And they're like, you were part of a collective podcast rather than just being you, right?
Yes.
Which is how the band was always for me.
Yeah.
So when I first started playing, though, I had like these, and this is going back to 97, 98. It was always like, oh no, I could be like the singer and I can go solo and I can do my own albums and I can write my own things. And I never did. And I would write things and then be like, these are awful. This is awful. This is terrible. And I would just put it away and, wouldn't have the sort of tenacity to push through it because I didn't think it was any good. And years later, I sort of realized like, oh, okay, and you and I talked about this on the phone the other day. It's is that I'm a perfectionist or is that I just don't think I can be good enough, so I'm not going to do it. And there's, to me, that's how a lot of my anxiety sort of manifests themselves. Of like, if it's not going to be good, then I don't think I even want to try it. And I'm afraid to like put it out there. And I'm like my own worst judge on that stuff. Whereas other people might be like, oh, I don't know, it seemed pretty cool. Like that was good. But I'm like, if it's not like the best thing I've ever heard, then I don't even want to try it. And that's totally shortchanging it. But when we got into the band situation and someone else was just sort of doing that heavy lifting, it was like, I can just contribute to this. It's kind of easy and I don't have to like put myself out there as much. But years later, I sort of forced myself into like, okay, you got to go. You've been thinking about this forever. You got to go do it. And it sort of came around where this person I'd gone to high school with, she like ended up marrying a guy who was a musician, and he ended up getting some gig at like the Triple Door, and he needed someone to play with him. So he was like, hey, I'm going to do this show. He called me. I'd never met him. He calls me up and he says, can you play a set as well? It's like solo acoustic singer-songwriters. Can you play a set? And I was like, yeah, sure, I can do that. And I hang up the phone. I was like, wait, I don't even have like any, like, I've never actually finished one of the songs I started. Like, and this was like 20 years later. So God. This is only like a handful of years ago. I had songs that I've been writing since 1998 myself that I never actually finished, but I was like, fuck it, I'll do it. And it was like a few months, the show was like, it was probably January and the show was in like April or May. And so I was like, all right, that gives me 3 or 4 months to like finish these things. So I just like got to it. But I would think, going back, I think that my wife would say it was like the worst. She was like, dude, you are such a pain in the ass right now. Because I was like, I got to like finish this. I'm working in the basement. I'm like, I could think of nothing else. That was all I could think about. Like at work, I'd be like sitting there like scribbling. I'd go at lunchtime into my car. I'd be playing the guitar and like working like every day. It was brutal. And I was like, brutal. This is not, I said it to her. I was like, this isn't fun. Like I'm killing myself because I'm so like freaked out about this, but I have to go do it.
It's that compulsion.
Yeah.
God,
but like,
you creatives.
Yeah, but then, like I got there and I was like, what have I done? Why am I here? I don't belong here. But I like pushed through it. It was okay, I think. And I did it a few more times. And that's how I like, for me, recognizing like, okay, you're going to like, this is going to be hard. You're going to hate this. You're going to freak out. You might have a panic attack. You maybe there's some things you can do to get through that. Maybe you have some glasses of wine or have some medication or something. But like, once you get through the other side and you realize you can actually do it, like that's the way that I start to fight the anxiety stuff. It's the same for public speaking. It's the same for,
So at what point do you realize that like the clinical anxiety might be a thing for you?
Once I started like getting into relationships, I had a girlfriend in college, and then I met Heather in 98. Heather's my wife. And we've been together ever since. But once you start spending all this like that concerted time with people, yes. They're like, man, you like have a really hard time making decisions, or you have a really hard time doing this or that. And I'd be like, do I really? Huh? I just thought like,
never noticed that before,
right? So people start pointing things out a little bit. But there was a particular episode that started to manifest itself, and the result of which was it manifesting in more physical ways. When I was 22, I had a seizure like randomly, and the whole like feeling of just lack of control to me just became so real after that. And I went to like all these doctor's appointments, like why did that happen and what happened, and nobody could really pinpoint anything around it,
which is so scary.
It's super scary. And so just trying to like figure out the physical side of that, but then also there was like all these just emotional and mental things that came with it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'd find myself in like similar environmental situations, like, you know, if whatever situation I was in started to feel anyway like the situation I was in when that happened, I would like suddenly have a panic attack. And I'd never had that physical manifestation of it before. And so it was like all I could talk about. My mom started like making fun of me about it because she was like, dude, you're like so exhausting right now to like talk to, you know, because like,
leave it to a mom.
I know, right? But like
Stop.
she would chalk it up to like you're an Irish man with this sense of like guilt and pain and you know everything else that goes with being Irish, you know.
You can't help it, Ronan, you're Irish.
Well, to the point where actually she bought me a T-shirt at Christmas time that said some quote of like to the effect of like, you know, I'm Irish, therefore I am like, you know, and I can't remember what the list of stuff, but I was like, I opened it up and I was like, okay, clearly something is going on here. Like that was one of the things, you know, mom with the T-shirt at Christmas time. And then, but as I would talk more and more about this, Heather was like, you know, I think that you have anxiety. You should go like talk to someone about this. So I went to go talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, tell me totally like everything you're saying, you know, but they'd start asking me questions about like habits I would have or things I'd do when I was younger. And I had forgotten about the whole thing, but I was reminded through talking through all this stuff. When I was like 7, I had whatever that hand washing OCD was.
Oh, yeah.
I would wash my hands, and then I'd be afraid to turn off the faucet because there's germs on it. So then I'd like turn it off, and then I'd be like, shit, I gotta wash my hands again.
Damn it.
And I'd just be in there like
over and over.
Just circuitous thing. And this was right when we moved from Ireland. So, you know, my mom had called her sister, who is I guess a psychologist, and they're like, well, yeah, I mean, sure.
It's interesting. So you were 22 when you had your seizure, and then did your panic attacks started after that?
Yeah.
So I was 20. I want to say I was 26 when I had my first panic attack.
Yeah.
And it was in Macy's downtown, and I had to travel for work, and I had to go to LA.
Yeah.
And I was always, I used to have anxiety dreams really bad.
Yeah.
And my anxiety dream in my early 20s, without fail, was that I had to be somewhere in 20 minutes. I had to pack my suitcase, and I would go into my closet and none of my clothes would fit. Like that was my thing. I would put on a jacket and it would like hit the floor. It was too big. Like it was like I was wearing like oversized dad clothes. I would have these dreams, and I would have dreams that my teeth fell out. And like, I had them all the time. And I was standing in Macy's trying to find something to wear for a work trip. And I mean, it came out of nowhere. And all of a sudden I couldn't breathe, and I felt my chest tightening. I dropped my stuff and walked out of Macy's because I was like, what is happening? Like I have to get air, and I just got to get out of here. Like this is clearly not where I need to be. Like I'm freaking out. But even at that time, I didn't really consider it clinical.
Yeah, I mean, the for a long time after I was trying to figure out like why did I have the seizure, and what are these things that are happening afterwards? You know, like one doctor was like, "Oh, you probably have agoraphobia," and I was like, "What's that?" And he's like, "You know, it's a fear of like being in public places with a lot of people around." I was like, "Okay, I don't think I have that just based on what I do."
Right,
but,
pretty sure that's
like,
not it.
I guess it happens when I'm in public places, so, but I don't think that's what it is. But he was like, well, you should look into that. And I'm like, well, that's why I'm here.
Yeah,
you know?
I thought that was your job.
So it was little things like that where nobody sort of pinpointed it quite yet for a while, until Heather finally was telling it, like saying, everything you're saying, regardless of the actual things, the way you're talking about it and the amount you're talking about and the way you're saying these things, it seems more like anxiety than anything else. Now, granted, I never figured out the physical part of the seizure, but
maybe you never will. I mean, that's the really shitty part of it,
but
isn't it?
One of the things was, you know, I had like gotten up after a night that the band had played, and we had somewhat of a late night going out drinking the night before, but it wasn't like the biggest bender in the world. But then I got up and, you know, smashed a Gatorade, and just the suspicion was that blood levels just went bonkers and what have you. But as a result of that, I had, you know, spent a lot of time sort of focusing on that. And the doctors are like, oh, well, maybe you're like hyperglycemic, which basically means like your blood, you get low, your blood sugar goes low, you're not like diabetic. So I got tested for all that stuff. And then, you start to have these physical manifestations. So for the longest time, I was convinced that's what it was. Where it's like, if I hadn't eaten, if I didn't get the right amount of protein or whatever, I was sort of making stuff up, maybe I didn't have enough carbs or whatever.
Yeah.
And, but Heather could tell, we'd be somewhere and she started just bringing snacks around for me. We'd be somewhere and I would, suddenly couldn't make eye contact and I'd start fidgeting and, all sort of the typical things of okay, this guy's freaking out. Or I'd start just rubbing my neck and just, getting really antsy. And she'd be like, you need to eat something. And I usually would and it would go away. But then I was sort of I don't know if that's really the thing either, because I might just be thinking all that, and then I might think I just gave myself a solution.
Cycle though, right?
Exactly.
It's just that spin.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, whether it was a result of that or whether it was just, one of those, I've heard in the past, every 7 years your body sort of changes, and I was sort of right around that time, maybe I was getting sort of like that, and I needed to have a little more sustenance on a more regular basis. I don't know, but that seemed to work for a little while, trying to manage it that way. But it didn't quite sort of eradicate just the fear part of it. I was always afraid that something was going to happen similar to that. And that was always that, even to this day, my panic attacks sort of manifest themselves and I'll be in a situation where I'll just be out of control. I'll be public speaking and something will happen and it'll happen in front of all these people and I can't do anything about it. And that's sort of my biggest panic attack style fear.
Yeah.
Public speaking, sometimes solo performances, if I'm playing guitar, that's where I force myself to push through that thing, because it's not going to happen. It's a thought. It's probably not going to happen, right? And later on, years and years later, when I decided, okay, I'm going to dig into this a lot more and start to go see somebody on a regular basis, and it was more of sort of on a mindfulness level, not necessarily straight up therapy, but more mindfulness plus therapy a little bit.
Yeah.
Once they started introducing this idea of thoughts versus reality, that's when I really started to feel okay, I can get control of this thing, because anxiety to me is just thoughts. It's just constant thoughts and worry, and it might manifest itself in physical ways, but it's because I've thought myself into that usually. See,
that's interesting though, because it is an out of control thing. So my experience of anxiety, because this will circle back, but I had that initial panic attack and then didn't think about it again, kind of lived my life, couldn't sleep, always had nightmares. Then I got pregnant with my son and left my job and was blissed out after I had my son. It was the best time. And my husband was like, oh my God, you sleep. This is amazing.
Which is usually the exact opposite, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think your job was really stressing you out. And I think that's what the differentiator was. Then the second that I got pregnant with Victoria, everything kind of changed and I felt different. I mean, my pregnancy was different. I felt miserable. I felt super anxious and out of control. Yeah. And there was a lot at that point in our lives that was out of control. So I just kind of thought it was stress. Yeah. But then I started having weird death thoughts. I got convinced that I would die in childbirth. Yeah. Also, I was convinced that I was not going to carry my pregnancy to term. But then once I had my daughter, it was the most out of control I had ever been. And I couldn't control my thoughts. I mean, Ronan, seriously, it was bad. I wanted to install bars on all of our windows because I thought for sure one of my kids was going to fall out. I mean, it was just dark shit. Yeah. And so after about 3 months, my husband had 2 weeks off after she was born. And then he left and it was me and Cricket. And a lot of moms handle that great. Yeah. And I should have handled that great too. Had I been myself, but I was not right. I couldn't talk without crying. And then you kind of isolate yourself more, which does not help. Yeah. And so finally I realized I'm not well. And I went in to see a psychiatrist and they were like, oh yeah. Yep, for sure.
Were they from Minnesota?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's what you have.
So here's a question though. And how do you separate, because I've read your articles. How do you separate the postpartum depression part from just general anxiety that you may have always had?
I don't think you can necessarily, right? I don't think anyone knows that. I'm not a doctor, but I think something in your chemistry changes.
Yeah.
Right? With your hormones, whatever.
Yeah.
And like the way the psychiatrist framed it to me, she's like, this is a solvable problem, but for sure you need medication.
Yeah.
Like it's like having strep throat. Like you need to balance yourself out, and then we can kind of handle it. But she's like, you're a new mom. The talk therapy probably, like, you sound like you have a pretty good handle on your self-awareness, which is why you're here.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you some Zoloft and see if that helps. And so I think at that point I was so desperate to feel better. Like I'm trying to describe the feeling. I mean, when you try to describe it, it's really hard. Like I get felt.
It. Yeah. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I think the postpartum thing, I think, is a depression on a
but
level
no,
that
it
most
wasn't
people
depression
wouldn't understand.
for me. It's different.
Oh, okay.
It was postpartum anxiety. I mean, it's a thing. They're married, right?
Yeah.
Anxiety and depression, but
Totally.
they manifest in such different ways for everybody. But but it's like that. Like I would find myself sweating in my pantry, organizing my cupboards, crying.
Yeah.
And it's like you like pull your head up and you're like, what the fuck?
Yes.
Well, I don't think people do this, nor I don't think this is normal.
I think that's the key, is like realizing like, oh, this isn't normal.
Right.
Because I think for people that have just sort of been that way all their life, they normalize it. Like, no, this is just how I am.
Well,
or like, this is just, but then you realize like, oh, it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And I think something you said resonated with me too, where you're like, looking back, I can kind of see that.
Yeah.
And now looking back, I'm like, oh, this whole time I thought maybe I was just an overachiever, but I really think that this has been my MO all along.
Yeah. Like I always struggle with the doctors being like, well, it might be anxiety or it might be depression. And I'm like, just the stigmas that go along with either one, you're sort of like, oh shit, I kind of hope it's anxiety.
I know. Well, there's so much shame still. And I feel like one of the bigger differences between the women I know and the men I know are a lot of women are okay, not okay, but will admit it kind of and say like, yeah, this is real for me. Like but I don't know if that's as common for men to have those conversations with each other.
Not in my experience. Like I when we talked the other day, I was saying, I think that I sort of pick up on little things that I hear people saying here and there, and I go, okay, sort of catalog that. Like maybe at some point I'll talk to this person about that, but they might be at a point where either they're trying to deal with it or they are dealing with it, and they're just being more vocal about it now, or they're not recognizing it yet. But there's little things, And there's been some people where I've said, a couple friends where I've said like, I think you might want to like maybe talk to somebody, and they're like, really? Huh? What do you mean? And that might have been them sort of shrugging it off, or maybe they really didn't know. And I sort of just left it, but left it open. Like if you want to talk about it, I'm totally down. But it's also one of those things where I realized that the only thing that got me to go look into it was talking more about it. Like, and frankly, just with my wife, who's still the only person I really talk to much about it. But the more I talked about it, the more I was like, okay, it's being validated. Like somebody is validating for me that there is something that I should go look into.
Yeah.
And when I did go and sort of get, quote unquote, tested for this thing, they're like, oh yeah, dude, like we should have been talking to you for a while. But again, the challenge with it, I think, is there's, in some cases it is like totally black and white. In others, it's just a mishmash of gray area where they're like, well, it might be depression. And frankly, your history speaks to depression. And I mean, my mom is the oldest of 10 and just about all of them have dealt with some level of depression in an ongoing basis. Anxiety is rampant in that family, but so is alcoholism.
Right.
And those things tend to be pretty linked.
Yep.
But then they're like, well, ADD also is like, it also manifests itself in kind of the same way sometimes, certainly with anxiety.
Yeah.
And so they're like, you might want to look into that too. And I'm like, well, should I just like hit for the cycle here? Like, I feel like I could take any medication you hand me right now and it might help. But, early on, I kind of went down like the depression path and like did a few cycles of the meds on that. And, it's and I'm sure you recognize this, it's like a quick up after it gets into the system. And you're like, oh, okay, I feel normal again. I feel like I can, get out of bed and not be like, today's going to suck. But then after a while, it's just like, felt like a zombie. It's like, I don't feel up or down. I just, I'm just kind of going through the motions.
Yep.
So I didn't like that. Because one of the things that I had often talked about once I started really like digging into this was that desire to be like really motivated versus, I should say really motivated, which is often kind of spurned by anxious thoughts. Right?
What you're saying right now is really resonating.
And they were like, oh, okay, this is a good topic. This is actually a pretty current topic. And you dig into like mindfulness. It's one of the things that people often struggle with is like, how do I stay really motivated but be okay with all my situations?
Yeah.
And I was like, how do you stay really motivated without being anxious? Because I feel like that's the thing that has like made me want to go and do more or be more or try to get further.
100%.
And they're like, well, you can still do that. You can just feel better about it.
Wait, what?
Yeah, right. And it's funny. I still joke to this day. Like I work in advertising. I'm like, you have to be a certain level of anxious to like even want to do that job because it's totally deadline driven. You're like freaking out all the time. You gotta like
that was
amp yourself, right? That was your
my job.
Right? So like you have to be kind of a
but
glutton.
It was yes, you do, and you do. But to be, I am not on meds at this moment.
Yeah,
Zoloft really made me fat and numb, and to be completely clear, helped me out of a very dark place.
Yeah.
So it was like a cost benefit analysis, right? So I was on Zoloft for a couple of years. I got off, was off for a while, and then realized that no, I need to be back on these.
Yeah.
And so got back on, then wanted to try out not being medicated anymore. And it takes a really long time to wean off. I don't know if you've ever stopped, but
I have,
it took me a good 2 months to be okay off Zoloft. And that first week is real bad. Yeah. Even if you're just half dosing, it was really tough for me. And it was like thoughts versus reality. Yeah. Like you're like, this isn't real. Like you just have to talk yourself down. But now that I am off meds, realizing that motivating piece of my personality is actually something that I really like about myself.
Totally, yeah.
But it comes with that double-edged sword of like perfectionism with pitting out if things aren't going your way. Like, for example, I went to the theater with my family today, and it became very important that I get to the theater because they have those boosters.
Yeah.
Right? You need a booster. You got a 5-year-old. So it was like, we're going.
Yeah.
And we are getting a booster. And it was like, I tend to glom on to things like that. But like now my kids know, they're fine with it. Yeah. They're like, oh yeah, we're for sure getting a booster. Like, don't be an idiot. We're going to be there so early. But recognizing exactly what you're saying, like you're probably going to have some baseline level of jitters at all times.
I think as long as you know that, great. Like you sort of use it, for good, not evil, right?
I mean, you can talk to my husband about that.
Right. No, I found that once I got, because I guess it was in my late 20s, early 30s where I sort of went through cycles of the med stuff. For me, it was recognizing how it feels to not have all the worry and just all sort of the underlying dark stuff. And once I got off it, I was like, well, I know how that feels. So that's all I kind of have to do, And as long as I sort of did my best to take care of myself at some level, which, I've never really been the best at, but being aware of that at least, like it was sort of an knowledge is power thing. Like as long as I knew that feeling and knew that it existed, I was like, okay, I can aspire to that. And the rest is just thoughts. And it's just, my mind playing tricks on me thing.
Well, I print out on my infographic here. Because I'm a mom and I was in advertising, so those really that I can't read. But
this
one of the
looks like
things,
an EKG reading. I'm like wondering what
it
this
does.
is.
See, when Ronan got here, I was like, "Hey, you want to know what gives me anxiety? My fucking printer." But it was like the common misconceptions about anxiety, and one of them, actually, it's written on here: always carry a paper bag in case you hyperventilate. But A misconception is if you have an anxiety disorder, it's important to avoid stress and situations that make you feel stress, right? But it's exactly what you were saying is that like you can't avoid life.
No.
Right? You can't. That's just not a thing that's going to happen, and sort of a healthy way to deal with it, which is amazing that you kind of chose that road before you even knew that you had anxiety. It was like, this is going to be terrible.
Yeah.
But I feel like I need to do it, so I'm going to lean into that.
Right. Well,
feeling.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I don't know. Go through the list. We'll come back to them because that's a good one to come back to. We'll flag that.
I like this one. If you eat right, exercise, avoid caffeine, and live a healthy lifestyle, your anxiety will go away. That's not true.
I don't know. I should try it.
I haven't tried it either. I've tried the exercise. Actually, really does help.
You know what? I will say, everyone I've ever talked to has been like, it may not go away, but it's going to help you a lot.
Yeah,
you know?
It does. I mean, I don't know if anything makes it go away. In fact, again, I come back to like your thoughts versus realities. Mm-hmm. My husband was out of town this week, and I'm actually fine being in our house by ourselves. Like we have an alarm, and it doesn't really bother me. But I was laying down to bed, and I'm laying there in the dark, and I'm like, what if somebody broke into our house? And then I started like going down this really dark road. And that happened. Like that is the thing. That is what my anxiety does to me, is like those thoughts come in, like the ability to recognize and say, okay, hi, this is not real. Yeah. Like we are going down this path. Like it is like a pep talk at midnight. We're like, hey, Shannon, hi, welcome back, anxiety. Great to have you. I need to go to sleep now. You know, we're fine. I set the alarm. We're going to be okay. Yeah. Like,
well, there you are, old friend.
Oh, welcome.
And it's easy to say that. It's hard in the moment to be like, okay, this is a thought, this is a thought. But you can sit there and write it down, you know?
Yeah.
I will say this with the full knowledge that like, I probably never do this myself, but I've been told as long as I know there are things, it helps me too. But, you know, getting up and like writing that stuff down, it just sort of gets it out and flushes the brain a little bit. Obviously the like yoga breathing thing helps me a lot.
Yeah,
I
me
think
too.
It helps a lot of people, right? And it just sort of like turns a lot of that cycle off. I will say, like,
I will get out of bed and like do a lap around my room and be like, you know, come on.
Yeah. For me, I will say that, you know, going back to sort of the beginning of this discussion, music has always been a thing that has helped me a lot. You know, and there were times when, as a kid, I used to play the drums, and I could just sort of like get in a groove, and it was almost like being in like a transcendental like yoga meditation thing.
Totally.
You know, like I'd get in a groove, close my eyes, and just go, and I would lose sense of time. Yeah. And that's all I focused on. And that was when I was like 10 or 11. And I can remember specific times where I would be like up at my drum instructor's studio, and he would have older students there, and he'd be like, watch this kid. Because he'd see me like close my eyes and just like sit there and like lean into this groove, and like I'd go for like a few minutes, and they'd be like just watching me. And then later on, like in college, if I was kind of like, you know, having just worrying thoughts or whatever, I would just pick up the guitar and just play for hours, and it would just sort of like melt away because I was focused. Like it just took everything else that was going on in my head and just put it into this one thing. So to this day, like if I know that I'm sort of freaking out, I can go do that. So I have that outlet, which is nice.
Yeah.
Right? But it's the same as sort of like, okay, I'm going to breathe for 2 minutes or what have you. Like
no, I mean, mine is working out. And in my early 20s, like I was, I mean, again, looking back on it now, I would do 2 a day spinning classes. Yeah. Because it was just like,
That's excessive. 2 a day.
It perhaps resulted in a torn labrum in my head.
There you go.
But,
okay.
But yeah, I loved it. And I mean, again, like part of my personality, I'm a little aggro, but having that outlet even now really, really helps. Like exactly what you said, like getting to a place where you cannot think about anything else and getting whatever release you need from it.
Well, I used to play soccer, and I remember saying to an uncle of mine, I was like, God, it's so great. You know, I go play soccer once or twice a week, and like, you know, you that's all you focus on, and you know, you sort of everything else just melts away, and all your worries for the week go away, and for that 1 hour or an hour and a half, like that's all you think about. And he goes, yeah, well, how could you think about anything else when you can't even breathe? Like, you know, when you're like, when your legs hurt and you can't breathe, and you got, you know, your chest is killing you. I'm like, oh, that's another way to put it. Yep. You know, I was coming more from a peaceful place, but now that you mention it, I'm like brutally out of shape. So actually, that's probably why. Yeah.
So I think all the time about my kids. I mean, we have kids that are similar ages. How do you kind of cope with the reality that they, being Irish, may also have this affliction? I mean, how does that translate for you into being a parent?
It's tough. I see it, you know, I definitely see it. You know, we're constantly trying to learn how to manage it ourselves, frankly, about anything in life. But like, absolutely. You know, we're trying to, that's the thing we're trying to learn too. And kind of being preachy to kids about like, all right, you got to like sit down and breathe. Take your rainbow breaths, goddammit. You know, like without really doing that ourselves. I mean, I find myself like getting angry at them, like telling them to take rainbow breaths. Oh my God,
I just did that today. So, why are you so tense?
Right. Stop freaking out.
Calm down.
Yeah. I have the worry about like labeling it with them at that age. Once you start sort of telling them about that stuff, like you might be different. Like that's a tricky one.
You might just really love the drums.
Yeah, well, that's
like a lot.
You know, I can see where that stuff. You know, my daughter is really good at piano and will sit there and like just zone out on it. You know, and that's a great outlet for her. I think the little guy might want to play the drums at some point. I think it'd be a good outlet for him. But regardless of whether it's a helpful thing or not, it's always going to be a good outlet, right? But yeah, you know, there's the cycle of like guilt that like, oh gosh, and like because of me, they might have this thing. But then it's like that doesn't help. You know, I don't know. There will have to be a discussion at some point of probably like, all right, like you might start to feel these things and you might be different than other kids and manage it other ways.
I mean, any kind of, mental illness is a category of what this is, right? Yeah. So it's a mental health issue. And I can say like, I have been to a very dark place that I did not know that I myself could have. Like I've always been a pretty happy, really driven person. Yeah. And so to get thrown that roadblock like you, like where you're now afraid of something that you didn't, that's potentially not real, but it's your chemistry that's different. Yeah. What I have realized in this last year of kind of getting off meds, which again, please stay on them if you need them.
Totally,
like, love it. Yeah. But for me, it was sort of a litmus test. Yeah. Also, because I think sometimes you just need to see where you're at, knowing that you can always go back on. Yeah. But one thing that I have realized in the last year is that anxiety actually is not all bad.
No.
Right? Like, if there's one takeaway from the anxiety episode, I can see that it is a huge part of my personality, good, bad, or indifferent. Yeah. That some parts of it I actually really like. Yeah. And I think that is one thing I want anybody listening to take away is that, you know, it, like you said, when you're on certain meds, you just feel numb and you kind of like want that edgy part of yourself back.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's kind of like embracing the duality of it. Yeah. Like you said, like there are going to be good days, bad days, but because you have this does not make you bad or wrong. Like there are really some good qualities that I think come with it. I think we are able to diagnose it more because we know about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like we absolutely know more than we did 20 years ago.
Totally. Yeah.
And would I have been able to accomplish what I accomplished without anxiety? Probably not.
Yeah. It's a part of you, you know, so you got to get like cool with that. Right? Like it's not like it's just going to go away. Right. It is always going to be there. It's just how you tend to manage it is different, and recognizing like this is what's happening right now. Like just because you know about it doesn't mean there's not going to be panic attacks. It's going to happen. Yeah. Right. But also, even just knowing it's going to happen, when it happens, you go, oh, that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, and you know you're not going to die.
Right.
Yeah, you know, you think you are that first time. Yeah. But then you realize you're not, and you just need a few, like, minutes.
Yes, exactly. I listened to a lot of podcasts about this, and Tara Brach is one who's amazing. I think it was one of hers. She was telling a story about somebody who was, like, a pretty well-known public speaker. I can't remember what it was, but it was, like, a pretty big event. This guy was doing speech in front of, maybe a few hundred people, maybe like 1,000 people. And he came out on stage and sat down and didn't say a word, and then sort of like put his head in his hand and was like sweating, nervous, heart pounding, shaking, and was saying this like into the microphone. And everyone's like, what is going on? And then after a minute or two, he was like, I'm sorry, folks. I'm having a little bit of a panic attack right now, but I'm naming what's going on. I'm recognizing it. He's going through like the recognize, analyze, investigate, and I can't remember what the fourth part of the RAIN thing is. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yeah, I can't remember either.
But he's basically going through that practice in front of hundreds of people and just walking himself through the whole thing and out of it, right? Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
To be A, that comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And B, like that knowledgeable about like, this is what's happening to me right now, and I'm going to be okay in a minute. I just got to like work through the steps. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like that's what's happening. And so for me, it's like, as long as I know that this is what's going on, then I can sort of be okay with it. I'm never going to be totally okay with it because it's not fun.
No.
But like,
you don't love it. Like you don't love when those pit sweats start happening.
Right.
And I know what my triggers are too. Like, I mean, I've had panic attacks in the last year.
Yeah.
And I think passing you or I on the street, you would have no idea.
Totally. That's actually a big part of it. Most people would be like, what are you talking about? You're like the guy that's always out in front cracking jokes, and like you're the guy leading the discussion in the room, and you're like the dude that leads the team at work and da-da-da. But that's all like a little bit of a, I push through that.
Yep.
And it's a little bit of a cover up too.
Yep.
I've always been like, I've dealt with it by being sort of a front man in a way of like joking and, always being really, outgoing and stuff. But like inside, I'm like, oh God, did that joke land? Was that I don't know. Is this going okay? Is everyone like good with what I'm saying right now? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. I think your voice is awesome.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you getting so vulnerable and real talking about this because it's super uncomfortable. Yeah. But like anything else, I feel like if one person hears this and is like, ooh, maybe I tick this box.
Yeah. Then
I feel like we will have made something else good out of the anxiety that we experience on the regular. Every day when I wake up and feel the need to clean my cupboards.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thank you, Ronan.
Thank you. This has been great.
This was an enjoyable hour, even though now I'm going to wonder if I'm going to go into my closet and have a panic attack later.
Well, thank you. This has been good.
You gotta let it shine on everything. You gotta let it.
Let the record show that I did not have a panic attack or clean my pantry out in an anxiety-driven frenzy at any point after this show was recorded. A huge thank you to Ronan for your vulnerability and honesty during this interview. This was a side of you that we haven't gotten to see, and I really appreciate you sharing it. Another thank you to Left Hand Smoke for permission to use their music during this episode. If you like what you hear, please rate or review it on Apple Podcasts. If you have questions or comments, please email me at infrontofmyface@gmail.com. Find me on Instagram at rightinfrontofmyface, Twitter at infrontofmyface. Just to give you a quick update on the show, episode 10 will air in 2 more weeks, and that episode will be the final one in season 1. I cannot believe it myself. I'm already busy recording for season 2, which will tackle topics like how to talk to our kids about race, the new nonviolent peace movement, and the opioid crisis. All of those are big things happening right in front of our face. Please, in the next couple of weeks, take a moment to ask somebody a deeper question. You never know what you might find.